Hello internet users! Guess what we're gonna talk about today? Mortal Kombat. There's just something magical about a series where violence is always the answer. Unless you know the inputs for the friendships, in which case you have the option to shamelessly push merchandise instead. And boy, did they sure like to do that back in the day. During the earlier years of the combat craze, they were pushing everything they could think of onto the store shelves. Toys, comic books, trading cards, spin-offs, and even a Saturday morning cartoon aired on TV. Still can't believe that one happened. And of course, people ate it up. Where else were they gonna learn about the private life of Kung Lao? But in my opinion, the worst and most often forgotten about of these cash-ins were the Game Boy ports. Oh boy, the Game Boy ports. Settle in everyone, because today we're going to take a look at the Mortal Kombat games that were released for the Game Boy family of systems. And of course, what else could we start with other than the first entry in the series? Just from this footage alone, I don't think you need me to tell you why it's bad. But in order to validate the time I spent playing it, I'm going to anyway. This is Mortal Kombat at its absolute worst. Everything has been downgraded to the point where it's unrecognizable from the arcade classic. Obviously, a perfect port of the game wasn't possible to put onto the system, but what's here is almost unplayable. The gameplay is incredibly slow and choppy, and the controls are just as bad. Inputs feel either delayed or just sometimes don't even work. I barely feel like I'm even in control of my character here. There's only 2 buttons, so instead of having high punch, low punch, and high kick, low kick, you just have punch and kick. Characters still have their special moves, but good luck getting them to work. It seems like no matter what you do, they only ever happen when they feel like it. You'll end up taking more damage than you deal from just trying to do them. As for fatalities, it's the same case. It took forever just to get footage of me doing one, and in the process of doing so, the game glitched out on me. Look at this. Instead of her getting up and displaying the finish her message, something hits her and she just dies. Even though I'm clearly on the other side of the screen and didn't do anything. You get the point. It's garbage. It's hard to believe that they even released and sold this in stores. If someone told me that this cartridge was a bootleg, I'd probably believe it. People like to give the Super Nintendo version a hard time, but spend a few minutes playing the Game Boy version, and you'll be begging to play that one instead. If you have a link cable and know someone with a copy of the game, you can play against each other. This is the case for every game we'll be looking at today, but I can't imagine why you'd ever want to put yourself through that. Apparently, it's also possible to play as Goro in this version. However, in order to do so, you need to beat the game. You'll then get a message saying that Goro lives as you. Of course, I don't have the time or patience for that, so we're just gonna cheat to make it happen. What the... Fergus? Bob? Eric? Why did all of the characters' names change? So, from what I could gather, apparently when you start playing as Goro, all of the characters are renamed to those of the developers of this version. I'm not sure how to interpret that. Did they do that because they were really proud of their work? Or were they so ashamed that they wanted to give the player a way to punish them? By the way, Goro controls just as bad and isn't any more fun to play as. Let's move on to the next game on the list. The Game Boy port of Mortal Kombat 2. This one is actually quite the improvement. You probably can't tell just from looking at the footage, but the difference in gameplay between this and the first one are night and day. This time around, the gameplay is much smoother, and the controls are very responsive. I'm able to pull off special moves consistently, and in addition to the regular fatalities, they even worked in babalities and a single stage fatality. They even went the extra mile and managed to include Smoke and Jade, probably from reusing sprites of the other characters included, but whatever, it's fine. Though it's a little funny to me that they made Goro's lair just a brick wall background. I did go in without any expectations, but all of this honestly isn't half bad. Of course, corners needed to be cut. It lacks the full roster in most of the stages like the previous game did, but it still manages to capture a bit of the charm of the original. Well, as best they could for the Game Boy anyway. Don't get me wrong here, I'll take the arcade or home console versions over this any day. But looking at it as a standalone game for the Game Boy, this is actually kind of impressive, and is likely the best that could be done given the limitations of the system. I'd honestly recommend checking it out for yourself. It may not be the best version of the game, but I can see someone having some fun with this back in the day. It's hard to believe the same developers who made the MK1 port are the same people who made this one. But it looks like they switched to a different team for the next game. Next up is Mortal Kombat 3. This one is awful. It suffers from all of the same problems that the first game has. It's slow, clunky, and all around is just a bad experience. There's not much I can say about it without repeating myself. The music is also just painful to listen to. What gives here? If MK2 could have a decent Game Boy version, then there isn't any excuse for why this one turned out so poorly. Just think about how many birthdays and Christmases were ruined by this abomination of a game. Imagine some poor kids spending weeks begging their parents for Mortal Kombat 3, and they ended up with this instead. Sometimes parents just didn't know any better, and that's exactly what these crappy versions preyed upon. They didn't care about quality, they just wanted to squeeze as much money out of the MK name as possible. Next up, we're going to move on to the Game Boy Advance. Now that they were working with more powerful hardware, they must have surely been able to make something good for this, right? Well, let's take a look at Mortal Kombat Advance and find out. This one is a port of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, and from what I understand, this is often considered to be the worst Mortal Kombat game, and by some, one of the worst Game Boy Advance games. It's not hard to see why. Aside from being another bad port with awkward controls and movement, the AI in this game is ridiculously cheap. They'll constantly throw out special moves faster than you ever possibly could, and even if you block them, you almost never have an opportunity to punish. The only way I was able to win a fight was by finding an exploit. In certain situations, if you just continuously walk towards them, they'll just back away. Then as long as you do nothing but punch, they won't fight back. But even then, the game still manages to make that difficult. I'm holding down left and pressing punch when I'm as close as possible, but sometimes I just randomly get pushed backwards. What is even going on here? And as if that wasn't bad enough, sometimes when Sub-Zero freezes me, for some reason he just can't even hit me. You'd think that now that they had an L and R button to use, they could have kept it as a 4-button fighter. But no, it's still only 2 buttons with A and B. And despite being on a better system, I'd still say that it's not even as playable as MK2 was. Plain and simple, it's not fun in the slightest. All it does is make you wish you were playing the real Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. And although it definitely deserves a negative reputation, I don't think I'd call it the worst of what we've seen so far. Alright, now on to the next game. So where did they go from there? How about a Game Boy Advance port of Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance?
Round 1. Fight!
Well, this caught me off guard. Rather than going back to a traditional 2D style for this version, they actually went for 3D movement like the console version. To be perfectly honest, I've never been a fan of the Mortal Kombat games with this style of gameplay, but seeing it done on the GBA is pretty neat. As a whole, this one isn't too bad. You've got multiple game modes, and a crypt that allows you to spend coins to get some unlockables. There's a fair amount of content here. When fighting, you can press the L button to switch between one of 2 fighting styles. This completely changes what you can do with your 2 attack buttons, while keeping your special move inputs the same. Though, I really have to say that this game has not aged well. I'm sure that this was really impressive at the time of its release, but looking at it now, not so much. I can't imagine anyone wanting to give it a go now, unless they have nostalgia for it. But to be fair, this type of fighting game isn't really my cup of tea, so I couldn't really get into it. Wait a second. Anime Scorpion? What the heck does this costume look like? Well, I hate to shatter your hopes, but all this does is change the black in Scorpion's outfit to blue. I don't really see how that makes him look anime, but okay. There was actually an updated re-release of this game titled Mortal Kombat Tournament Edition. This one featured more characters while also removing some of the ones in the previous version. From what I understand, it also fixed some bugs and balance issues, so if you really want to try this game out, I guess the Tournament Edition is the way to go. These two aren't a bad package. If I had either of these when I was a kid, I'm sure I would have enjoyed them. But even then, I'd still rather go with the console version if given the choice. But of course, we can't end on that note. This is a YouTube video after all. I'm obligated to be negative the majority of the time, which is why I've saved the absolute worst game for last. Ladies and gentlemen, brace yourselves for Mortal Kombat 4 for the Game Boy Color. Where do I even begin with this mess? Just look at it. Unlike the first 3 Mortal Kombats, the 4th game in the series was the first to be 3D, so there weren't any 2D animated characters to work with. They had to make their own assets based off of the 3D models. And geez, do they not look good. I almost feel embarrassed for whoever made them. The colors don't help either. The whole game looks like a clown threw up on it. You all probably have realized it by now, but the gameplay is also pretty horrible. By the way, I hope you like that song that's playing in the background, because it's the only one in the entire game. From the title to the character select to the actual fighting, it's the same annoying tune that feels like it loops every couple of seconds. My guess is that all of the voice clips they stuffed in there took up too much of the cartridge space to fit anything else. Was it really necessary to include those at the cost of so much? Now I'm curious though, what do the fatalities look like in this game? Wow. I didn't think it was possible at this point, but they somehow managed to leave me even more disappointed. What the heck am I looking at? So because I guess they were too lazy to make actual fatality animations, they instead just took a few frames of them from the arcade version and threw them onto the Game Boy. How long did it take them to make this game? An hour? How in the heck was this allowed to be released? As a port of Mortal Kombat 4, it's a joke. As a game, it's just plain disgusting. It's the most blatant and shameless cash grab I've ever seen. They just threw it together, slapped the MK name on it, and called it a day. There's even a few things that look like they were taken directly from the Mortal Kombat 3 port. Sometimes when I insult a bad game, there's always somebody out there that gets mad and defends it as a treasure of their childhood. But this... there's absolutely nobody in the world that would ever try to defend this. Not only is this easily the worst Mortal Kombat game out there, but it's also one of the worst commercial games I've ever played. You know, all the time I hear people say that the gaming industry is going downhill, and that we need to go back to the good old days. But if you ask me, those good old days weren't all sunshine and rainbows either. No matter where you look, there's always going to be somebody wanting to get some quick cash for a little effort. And as a result, we end up with shovelware like most of these ports. When it came to the Game Boy, everybody looks back fondly at the joy they had playing Pokemon or Zelda, but a terrible version of Mortal Kombat is left to be forgotten like the piece of garbage that it was. My name is Pikasprey, and thanks for watching.